Welcome to On the Fly College Edition, a podcast presented by Playfly Sports. I'm your host, Gene Defilippo. Playfly Sports is the full-service marketing and media company bringing digitally enabled innovations to the sports industry. Welcome to this week's On the Fly. I'm your host, Gene Defilippo, and our guest this week is Bill Polian. Bill is a six-time NFL Executive of the Year. He was general manager when the Colts won the Super Bowl. He was the general manager for a Grey Cup victory in Canada. He's in the Indianapolis Colts Ring of Honor. He's in the Buffalo Bills Wall of Fame and in the National Football League Hall of Fame. A real, true Hall of Famer in every sense of the word. Welcome, Bill Polian. Thank you for being on this show. It's a thrill to have you and someone of your experience and expertise. This is great. Let's get right into it. It seems like the colleges are going through something very similar to what the NFL went through. You were on the many committees that helped to put together the NFL plan, where there's a collective bargaining agreement. There's the players have formed a union. It seems like that's where we're headed in college. How do you see it, Bill?
Well, it is, as Yogi Berra once said, it's deja vu all over again. The NFL, in many respects, the colleges are going through what we went through from 1987 to 1993, which was prolonged labor wars, court cases that had to do with free agency, many other issues that had to be dealt with, and a collective bargaining agreement with our union, which expired, and then the union in turn dissolved itself. So there was chaos. There was really no one to bargain with for a period of time. And that's the situation the colleges find themselves in right now. The NCAA is essentially rudderless and really plays no role in what's going forward. The college commissioners our conference commissioners are changing rapidly in terms of the personnel and certainly are not cohesive. They couldn't agree this past spring on a new format for the college football playoff going forward. And I think in many respects, all of that chaos replicates what we saw between 87 and 93. And as you said, I was a participant in all of that, both as a negotiator and helping to make policy and so forth, and working under a genius, a guy without whom we would never have survived in the form we're in right now, and with the kind of largesse and riches that we now have in the NFL without Paul Tagliabue. He was the driving force behind it, as was Gene Upshaw, the union leader for the NFL Players Association. Now, there is no union leader, if you will, on the players' side in college, but that we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I think from the college standpoint, I see this as a four-legged stool, and the legs are as follows. Number one, there's media, not only the broadcast networks, but the streaming people, because sports are the only thing that draws a universal audience. It's the one thing that brings people to any media platform at which it's on. It's the universal solvent. That's why all this money is sloshing around, because it's the only thing that drives viewership in any kind of aggregation. Everything else in media is segmented. Markets, you got to be in markets. There are markets, top 8-10 markets in the country drive all the viewership. drive all the ads. That's that's where the people are. That's where the money is. That's where the advertisers want to be. That's what drives the medium. And so control of markets becomes really important. The NFL, look at the markets the NFL are in. Very simple. 28 of the 32 markets are the top 28 in the country. And we did not have a presence in Los Angeles for a long period of time. They're back in Los Angeles now. Hammer and tongs, NFL Network, the new stadium, Super Bowl, et cetera, et cetera. So the third leg of the stool are the conferences and what they will or will not become over time. And they won't know in reality what they will or will not become over time until such time as they know what money's available to them through media and markets. And then the fourth leg of the stool, which really would take a whole nother show, I think, to talk about, is how you pay the players, whether it's NIL or something else. Justice Kavanaugh's concurring opinion in the recent Supreme Court case that the NCAA lost pointed out very clearly that unless the colleges find some way to compensate the players, that in his view, and obviously he's part of a voting bloc that's in control of that court right now, in his view, it was a prima facie antitrust violation. The phrase antitrust scares the living daylights out of every entrepreneur in America because it carries with it another phrase called treble damages. Treble damages means that if you commit an antitrust violation and a jury says, okay, or even a judge says, okay, you're guilty, and the damages are $10 million in a antitrust violation, they're trebled. It's now $30 million.
Wow.
The phrase treble damages sends NFL owners rushing for medication and oxygen tanks and things like that. It scares the living daylights out of people because it is an incredibly large penalty. And I'm not an attorney, but Justice Kavanaugh wrote in very clear English that he thinks that employment situation is, or lack thereof, is a violation on its face. So that's why I say that's a separate issue, but that can't be resolved until we go back to the other two legs of the stool, or the other three actually, which is media, markets, and conferences. And one drives the other. It's almost like a pyramid. And most of the media contracts with all of the various conferences and entities like the college football playoff all expire between 24 and 25. So we are at a tipping point. And while I don't know what drove UCLA or USC, first hand, second hand, third hand, I have no knowledge of that. But it seems to me logical that they wanted to get themselves positioned in a situation that would derive for them the most money. And they had to do it quickly because all these agreements are going to be negotiated within the next 24 months. So that's the landscape we're in right now. And that's sort of I tried to explain why we're in that landscape. It's not just because USC and UCLA want to play in the Big Ten. That has nothing to do with it. Nothing at all. It has to do with where are we going to get the most revenue? Where are we going to have the most media exposure? Where are we going to be able to control the most markets? And conversely, just like the Big Ten did when they moved into the Washington, D.C. and New York metro markets with the addition of Maryland and Rutgers. They're moving in now into the LA market, which is the second largest in America, with USC and UCLA with two premier names, and they're they're the big dog right now. They're going to, and their rights negotiations are almost beginning, literally almost now. So they're sitting in the catbird seat, and everybody else is reacting to it.
Right. Bill, let's talk about NIL for a minute. Most people publicly are saying that it's not pay for play. You and I have been told by many, many people off the record that it is pay for play. And basically, if you look at it, it's free agency, and that players can leave one team and go to another with no penalty. It's free agency without a salary cap. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. If you're going to have free agency, then there's two things that you need to worry about, and this was the Rubik's cube that we had to deal with and construct, and then negotiate with the Players Association back in 87, between 87 and 93. If you have free agency, you have to worry about competitive balance, because free agency carries with it the right of the player to go and demand the biggest payday or the biggest location that he wants whenever his contract allows him to do so, and unless it's governed by a larger entity like a collective bargaining agreement. So in order to have free agency, you have to have some rules or some framework that does not allow every player to be free every year. Otherwise, you have chaos. Unfortunately, because the NCAA, it seemingly, at least to me, out of nowhere, just decreed that everybody could transfer once with no penalty. They created free agency, maybe unknowingly, but they created free agency. But there is no governor. There's nothing like a contract with the player that says, no, you can't leave until this contract is up. There is no salary cap to limit what players can be paid in the aggregate. There are no rules. And so, as Nick Saban and others have said in the college community, Coach Berry, the head of the AFCA, there's, it's the Wild West. And as a result, USC being the best example, I don't know, they've gotten close to a dozen transfers, I think. Well, that's exactly what we predicted would happen when we negotiated with Gene Upshaw. Commissioner Tagliabue, pointed to George Young and I at a meeting at one point and said, if I let these two guys loose in the marketplace, nobody else would win a game. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but it makes the point that if you have markets, and New York Giants, obviously with George Young at the helm, and you have people who are capable of identifying and coaching talent, Marv Levy as an example, it's hard to beat that with where there's no counterbalance to it. So that's the situation the NCAA is in right now. It seems to me that it would make perfect sense, and I've read that the AFCA has put this forth, that you would limit the time of year when people can transfer, when they can actually go into the portal. If you limit it, let's say, to the month of February, I'm picking this out of the air, just, because by that time the bowl games have ended. And then maybe the month of May, after spring practice is over, at least you'd bring some semblance of order to what is now a completely out of control process. That's the free agency part. There is no salary cap. There is no governor, and there are no rules with NIL. And originally, the NCAA said NIL can't be controlled by the schools. Now we know that the vast majority of schools are, in one way or another, setting up a separate entity, but one that's essentially tethered to them, which makes sense because you don't want third parties, independent contractors running around, boosters running around, paying players willy-nilly. And whether the payment is for appearance at a car dealership or for an appearance at a football camp is immaterial. It's nonetheless payment. So, we need to get, at least in the media, we need to get past the idea that NIL is somehow pristine and not related to the marketplace. It's directly related to the marketplace.
Sure. Bill, how do you get a salary cap on the NIL without having a union or somebody to negotiate with?
The simple answer is you can't. The simple answer is you cannot. Unless a conference, for example, had the world's greatest lawyers and was able to craft a salary cap without the concurrence of a players union or some other entity that represented the players, and it could pass antitrust muster. I should add, by the way, that the lawyer that gave us all 24-hour migraines, named Jeffrey Kessler, is also representing many of the plaintiffs in these college athletic cases, one of which went most recently to the Supreme Court. He is a tremendous, incredibly difficult adversary to deal with, and that's understating the case. He's a great, great lawyer and a bulldog. So, and he too has been through this movie before. So that's I'm laughing only because I'm not on the other side of the table from him. That's a difficult task.
Yeah. Will the players unionize? Can they? I mean, what are your thoughts going forward?
Well, it seems to me that unionization for the schools would be a rather easy answer, because unionization brings with it, I'm going to give you a lawyer's phrase now. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't even play one on TV. But I got this from Oliver Luck, who is the non-statutory labor exemption is an exemption to the antitrust laws that comes with a collective bargaining agreement, bargained, again, lawyer's phrase, at arm's length, between a union representing the employees and an entity representing the owners. In the case of the NFL, it's the NFL Management Council, and the union, of course, is the NFL Players Association. If you had a college players union, let's say, of some kind, or even disparate unions, the Teamsters in the Big Ten, the steel workers in the ACC, something, you could have something like that. The auto workers someplace else. You would negotiate with that entity, and you would negotiate NIL rules, you would negotiate work rules, you would negotiate health benefits. All of those things come with a collective bargaining agreement, and as long as they're bargained in good faith by both sides, and both sides agree to them, they are virtually immune from court challenge. And so it's logical, if you've been through this before, to say, well, unionization is really the answer. There are three problems with that. The first and I talked to a conference commissioner not long ago, a former conference commissioner who really filled me in on what the landscape is like. The first problem is that it's hard for people who lived in the NCAA, quote, student athlete model for a long, long time to even come to grips with the fact that maybe these people who've been, to them, student athletes are now employees and members of a union. It is hard to get past that from a psychological standpoint. That's number one. Number two, the private schools like BC, where you were, Notre Dame, Stanford, et cetera, Northwestern, where there was an attempt to unionize. I don't know what came of it. I know it was defeated the first time around. There has to be an election, by the way. That's how unions form. The employees or the members of the group that wants to form the union have to vote to unionize. The private schools don't have any restrictions in terms of state laws necessarily in terms of having their people unionize. I'm told, and I was actually surprised by it, that there are many states, principally in the South, in SEC country, where there are laws against students unionizing, and there are very strong strictures against other unions coming in and organizing. So with the state schools, that's a problem, because if you unionize, they would become state employees. Now, you know, that as I said, that's another very complex issue that we'd need labor law experts to talk about. I'm not, that's way beyond my pay grade, but unionization on its face worked in the NFL because it carries with it the non-statutory labor exemption. So now you can go as an entity, the NFL. That's why the NFL can go and negotiate its television contracts as one entity. Congress gave them an exemption a long time ago. It's blessed continually by the CBA. That's why there's a draft, all of those things. Same was true with Major League Baseball. Same is true with the NBA. So, you know, does that come about at the collegiate level? I would imagine that at some point the private schools will you know, people will, Stanford among them, as an example, there'll be people that will try to unionize those athletes, and it's probably ongoing as we speak. There are a number of groups out there that are talking about that. I mean, talk publicly about it. You know, does that happen? It can. If it takes place, that will change the landscape a lot, because in America, if you work in a company that has a union, or an industry that has a union, and you're not a member, or your employer is not a member of that group, that employer pretty much still has to track what the union members get at the bargaining table. So it causes some economic reactions that, you know, in the long run may or may not be beneficial. But it's all about, unions are all about getting money for their employees, their members. That's what it's about. So, and President Biden talks about that seemingly every time he gives a talk. So, you know, that's part and parcel of that fourth leg of the stool, which is, how do you pay the players? You have to find some way to do that, and there are many different ways. I think for us in the NFL, revenue sharing was the hardest part of it, and I still think that's a really hard part for any entity, any multiple, you know, employer entity. But and it's always been an issue at the college level. Witness, you know, Texas and in the Big 12, and and the shares and the return from the Longhorn Network. But it's a complex problem. But if there's no money coming in from the media side, the revenue side, that problem's moot. So it all goes back to, how do we generate the most revenue? And that is who controls the most markets.
Yeah. Bill, please go into that a little bit. The sharing of funds, go into that a little bit more about why that was a concern with some of the NFL owners.
Well, it's a very simple equation. On the one hand, you have New York, Chicago. Let's go back to the founding of the NFL or the early years of the NFL. You have New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, nowadays Houston, Dallas, Los Angeles. They have huge populations. They have huge stadiums. They tend to be big market people who draw in lots of revenue from ancillary stuff like advertising and marketing and so on and so forth. And of course, they're the biggest draws in television. So when television first came about in the 1950s, the Cleveland Browns had their own television network, their own television deal with Dumont Network. The Giants had a television deal, and the Chicago Bears had a television deal. Those three teams privately, independently. And Commissioner Rozelle came along and said, if we pool our resources and negotiate together for the then 12 teams in the National Football League, we will make more money aggregately than you three will make separately. And the Mara family in New York, the Hallis/McCaskey family in Chicago, and Paul Brown, and eventually Art Modell in Cleveland said, yes, we'll join everybody together and go negotiate as a group. It required an antitrust exemption, but as Commissioner Tagliabue used to say, that's a detail. The bottom line is that they gave up their individual rights to join together as a group. With the old saying that you and I grew up with as teenagers, team together, each of us achieves more.
Right.
So that's what revenue sharing is all about. We live today in an age very different from that when the NFL first began to aggregate its television rights. We live in you could argue that this Supreme Court is not a conservative court, it's a libertarian court, really. We're in a much more libertarian age. Can you do that again? Can you share revenue? Now, the conferences, you would know this far better than I, the conferences do share revenue.
Right.
But, how much is too much, and you and I have talked about this a lot too. You have a very good handle on it from the collegiate side. There is a point where that pie can only be cut so many ways, where the aggregate together reaches a law of diminishing returns, and people become upset and jealous. Somebody in the Los Angeles market, it drives the whole equation, USC and UCLA, and Stanford, let's say, in the San Francisco market, and Washington in the Seattle market, and they say, well, we're driving this train. We're the ones that are providing all the viewership and all the advertisers, and all you other folks get the same share we do. That's the good arguments on both sides of that. And those arguments can be contentious. And so it takes great leadership to be able to forge that consensus to where you're going to share revenue. So let's fast forward to, was the Big Ten got 16 teams now?
Yes.
Yeah. So if their media contract is going to be what, 60 million a team, or a school, I should say, going forward on a yearly basis, who's going to add to that if they bring in 4 more teams? Who's going to make that pie bigger? Because if you don't make the pie bigger, what happens? Each slice becomes smaller.
Right.
So it's really very simple. There's a point where expansion, and if you expand to markets that don't expand the revenue base, becomes counterproductive.
All right, let's just say, for example, that the Big Ten is interested in expanding to 18 teams. And the 2 teams that they bring in, it could be just X or Y, but they don't bring in $70 million apiece. Is it a possibility going forward that the Big Ten would say, okay, we'll have you in our conference because we need more teams and all, but you're not going to share in the exact revenue that these other people are sharing. We'll give you X, but it's not going to be what we're making. Is that a possibility?
Sure it is. Yeah, you can negotiate anything. It's a question of, do both parties agree to that, and do will both parties be willing to live with it? That's the more important question going forward. That's the statesman question. The first question is a purely economic question. Do you agree to it? And legal question. Yeah, yes, I do. Sure, I want in. 5 years later, is everybody going to be happy? Or are we going to have some disgruntled partners? That's where statesmanship on the part of leadership comes in. And that's what's sadly been missing, certainly in the NCAA over the last 5-6 years.
Right. Good point.
And frankly, was missing in the NFL before Commissioner Tagliabue, in the interregnum, when Commissioner Rozelle was no longer handling labor relations, and when Commissioner Tagliabue came in. I mean, that was, we were in the same boat.
Yeah. Bill, let's go back for a minute. You and I both coached on the collegiate level. We understand the importance of a locker room being a cohesive, happy locker room, how important that is. What would an offensive lineman be saying in a locker room when the quarterback is making $5 or $6 million and the wide receiver's making $1 million through NIL, and I'm making $10,000 as an offensive lineman? How does that affect the locker room?
Well, the term used in the NFL is financial chemistry. It affects it greatly, because if players feel that they're being taken advantage of, or they feel, more importantly, that the guy who's making all the money is not A, performing well enough to earn it, and B, is not helping put money in their pocket, it leads to disaffection. It's a very difficult problem to handle. And we have seen through free agency numerous teams who have made free agent acquisitions and ruined the financial chemistry of their locker room. And, there's no coach that can handle that. It's very, very difficult, because that's destruction from within. Once you get that jealousy and all of that stuff surfacing, then you no longer have a team. So the people that craft the policies have to be very clear about, this policy is good and will work for the good of the whole. This policy is not. And that's one of the reasons Commissioner Tagliabue added George Young and Jim Irsay and Steve Gutman and myself to the original management council team that was going to craft and negotiate with the union, because he wanted people who understood he himself, having been a Division I college basketball player and been a scholarship athlete at Georgetown, understood what the chemistry of the locker room was all about. And he understood that we had to come to some sort of an agreement that would maintain that chemistry as much as possible. Players, by and large, at least on the pro level, as long as they are making a decent wage and they feel they're being compensated fairly, don't begrudge the stars their money. They really don't, because they know who, as you and I know, the players know who the good players are, right?
Right.
They always know. If you want to know, you want the best scout in the world, go ask the left tackle. He'll tell you who the best defensive ends are. So as long as it's, quote, fair, if it matches up with the level of performance, they're generally okay. But the kind of disparity that you just described is difficult. It's very difficult. That's why when the NFL instituted the practice squad, it was a difficult negotiation, because the union wanted to make sure that there would not be this huge wage disparity between the 53rd guy on the active roster and the original 8 guys or 10 guys that were on the practice squad. So, they were well aware, the union was well aware of that as well. I don't know, I do know that people are buying up whole squads, image and likeness licenses. The collectives are buying them up from the individual players, but that it's, if you have a big number of walk-ons, you're talking about 125 players. That's a lot of people that are not making a lot of money.
Right.
As opposed to, 35 guys that actually do all the playing when it's all said and done. So that disparity exists at a much bigger level in college than it does in the pros.
Sure. All right. We're almost out of time, but I want to review with everybody, because NIL is such a big thing, and everybody is talking about it. How, again, does the conferences, or how do you regulate and get some rules regarding NIL without having a union of players to where you'd have a collective bargaining agreement? How else can you do it?
Well, it's well above my pay grade, but I've asked that question of some lawyers who do command that kind of salary. And the answer is that you would have to almost do it conference by conference. You couldn't do it as an aggregate, because we're talking about violation of the antitrust rules now. You have to do it in a way that, with respect to NIL, it's documented, that it isn't just cash in hand for nothing. Player would have to make appearances, would have to, he has to sign a contract. That's true now. The contracts can be different. Your contract can be different than mine. If you're the quarterback and I'm the right guard, the contract can be different. But there has to be contractual obligations involved. And then you would have to try and craft a policy conference-wide that set a floor, so that the walk-ons and the guys who don't do the playing, the 70 guys or so that don't do the playing, I don't know about walk-ons, that would probably be state to state or school to school, but the guy that, of 85 scholarships, 35 guys do the playing. So the other 50, would have to be protected in some way, I think. That's the really difficult part, because it gets back to, are they employees? What does the contract say? Who is their employer? In terms of one example that I've heard detailed in chapter and verse, is that the players sell their name and rights to the collective, and the collective, in fact, employs them as representatives. They make the deal. The collective makes the deals. They file the tax returns. All of that kind of thing is done by that separate 501c3 collective which is tethered to the school in some manner. If you did that conference-wise and you set up some sort of baseline requirements, I'm told that by people that are, very smart in this area that it might pass muster, but the word might is in italics and quotation marks.
Yeah, this is a complicated. It's a complicated issue. There's really no simple answers. That's why you're so valuable to us in college, because you've been through this. You and who was it? George Young and John Mara, and a lot of you that went through this 5 or 6 year period. And these were long nights that you all spent doing this.
Oh Lord, yeah. The negotiations were difficult, and the internal, Commissioner Tagliabue said that the internal negotiations were as difficult, if not more so, than the external negotiations with the union, because as we talked about before, revenue sharing came into play in a big way. Somebody had to pay for this. All of that was really difficult, and that's with 32 owners. Now, at the college level, you're dealing with, in terms of the teams that really move the needle, probably when it's all said and done, 60. But the idea of, I will say this, I haven't talked to anybody who believes, as I foolishly did at the outset of these discussions, this kind of milieu that takes place, that unionization would solve the problem. I don't think you can have a 60 team conference, if you will, super conference, which is where we're headed, really. I mean, we all think that eventually.
Sure.
That can do one deal with one union. I mean, it's probably not possible because of varying state laws and so forth and so on. So you're gonna have very probably a bifurcation of conferences, and my guess would be 3 or 4 when it's all said and done.
Right. Bill, is there anything else that you would like to say that I have not asked you, or that you think is important to say?
I think it's important for people to realize, fans and media alike, to realize, let me parenthetically add, this goes back to what we began in 87 and concluded in 93 in the NFL. This is a brave new world. And all of the paradigms that all of us grew up with in this business, in many ways, other than treating the players fairly and taking care of them and looking out for them and making sure that they have a good academic experience and a good collegiate experience, other than that, the old paradigms don't apply anymore. This is a brave new world, just like it is in the media world, just like it is in medicine, just like it is in politics. We're living through sea changes in our society, and this proves that sports is not immune from it.
Right. That's a great point. Sports is not immune from it. Yeah, very good. Bill, you are absolutely one of a kind. That was so great. Thank you.
All right.
You really, I mean, you brought this thing to the table. I mean, how do you do this? Nobody has sat and talked about it publicly. This is what you're going to have to do. And you can't unionize with 60 different teams, and you can't do this. So this is going to be a long, painful road that we're on here in college athletics. If it took the NFL with 32 teams, if it took you almost 7 years to do this, or 6 years, think of what it's going to take college athletics. It's going to take a while.
It will. What's astounded me is how quickly things have moved. You and I have talked a lot about this because we're, our friendship and obviously we're interested in it. we thought last year when Texas and Oklahoma left, well, yeah, there'll be reorganization, but it'll probably come 2, 3, 4 years down the road.
Right.
And boom, a year later, a seismic change takes place. And as we speak, I'm sure that the new commissioner, or maybe even Bob Bowlesby before he leaves office, of the Big 12 and the commissioner of the Pac-10 now are struggling to try and negotiating, trying to find an answer. The Pac-12 said they are.
Right. The Pac-12 presidents asked the Commissioner Kliavkoff to go ahead and start negotiations a year early with television. And I don't know if it's true or it's not, but it seems to me that the Big 12 is trying to convince some of the Pac-10 teams to join the Big 12. So we'll hang on here. We'll know something soon.
Yeah, and the rapidity of it is what is shocking. The fact that these things move so quickly is shocking. The one thing we haven't touched on is the grant of rights for the ACC. The ACC has a contract that doesn't expire until what, 32 or 33?
Yeah, I think it's 35, Bill.
35, excuse me.
Yeah.
So they're locked in. Their ability of teams to come and go from that conference is much different than some of the others. That Pac-12, Big 12 collaboration, merger, whatever you want to call it, can happen pretty rapidly. The ACC is an exception to that, at least on the surface anyway.
Right. Bill, this has been great. I can't thank you enough. I really can't. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate the one-of-a-kind reference. My father said it a different way. He said, "Hey, Bill, some people are stupid, but you abuse the privilege." So what little knowledge I have, I'm happy to share.
Oh my God, that's too funny. That is too funny. All right. Hey, thank you, my friend. I'll call you later this week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. All right. Bye, Bill. We're out of time on this week's On the Fly College Edition. I'm your host, Gene Defilippo. Thanks for your time this time, and we'll see you next time.